It's time for Cutting Edge Consciousness with Freeman Michaels and Barnet Bain. Thought-provoking discussions and bold ideas from the edge of possibility.
Welcome to Cutting Edge Consciousness. Freeman Michaels here with my co-host,
Barnet Bain. It's good to be here. Nice to see you this week.
It's great to see you, and it's great today to have an amazing guest.
We have a very special guest joining us from London, where I guess it's 20 after 10, 10:30, so we should jump in without further ado. Our guest today is Lynne McTaggart. Lynne's one of the preeminent spokespersons on consciousness, the new physics, and the science of spirituality, as well as the award-winning author of 6 books, including The Intention Experiment and The Field. She's also co-exec director of 2 publishing companies, which publish some of the world's most respected health and spiritual newsletters, including What Doctors Don't Tell You and Living the Field. So Lynne joins us today from London to discuss her new book, The Bond, subtitled Connecting the Space Between Us. Lynne, welcome.
Oh, hi. It's great to be with you guys.
And thanks for staying up past your bedtime. So I loved this book.
If I was going to do it for anyone, it would be for you.
Thank you so much. I love this book, and I have been after you since we saw each other in January to come on the show, and I'm very grateful that that we have you here today.
Oh, wonderful.
After reading this, you know, I was saying to Freeman at lunch, there was a time, for a long time, that I would say to myself, I am not my brother's keeper. And that evolved, and eventually I would say, I am not my brother. And then, or I'd say, I am my brother. I went from I'm ruined this.
Yeah, you
I'm
really
not
did.
my brother's keeper, evolved into I am
My brother's keeper.
I am my brother's keeper, which evolved into I am my brother. And that, more than ever, is one of the subtexts of your new book.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think that's probably the shock, because it's really a switching of messages that we've had since the kind of 1980s, particularly, and, well, for many centuries now, but particularly the sort of last part of the last century, we were very much moving toward the, you know, I only have responsibility for myself. I'm responsible for no one else. And we're starting to understand how wrong-headed that idea is. It's not only bad for the planet, it's against our nature. It's against our biology.
Huge. And in fact, one of the things that I loved about the book, this is Freeman, by the way, is the way that you tap into nature as a way of illustrating our nature, and how far, of course, we've gone from that is example. The example, of course, is how we're destroying our planet. But the quality in nature that's synergistic, how it's a system that cooperates and is very interdependent, which is very different than the way we tend to view it in this current climate.
Well, this was the problem. I mean, you know, lots of things write the story we live by. You know, there's so many different things, religion and philosophy and culture, et cetera. But, you know, we're very much influenced by the scientific definition of who we are. And up until now, I mean, and really from about 3 centuries ago plus, the world was described by the scientists of the day, like Newton, as a kind of a place that was populated by separate things. And those things could only affect each other by, you know, physical force. And then we got Darwin weighing in with the whole idea of survival of the fittest. Now, Darwin never actually coined that term, and his idea about competition was much more theoretical and metaphoric than it is believed to be. But his ideas basically got hijacked by a lot of burgeoning movements of the day, like capitalism and many things like that, where, you know, it served the purpose to say, you know, by looking out for number one, we serve the common good. And that's pretty much been our mantra since then. What's in it for me? And, you know, and the problem that I found when I started looking at physics, which I've been studying for a long time, quantum physics, but also biology, psychology, anthropology, sociology, all the ologies, was basically that, this is completely incorrect. Nature is not about domination. Nature is about very intricate cooperation, so much so that in every aspect of nature, from subatomic particles to giant-scale societies, there is a bond, by which I mean a relationship and a connection so profound that it is very difficult to determine where one thing ends and another thing begins.
Well, you say that subatomically there is no such thing as an individual thing, and that is contrary to the story that we have lived by for centuries now, out of which has grown this idea that the present is the result of the past. It's an expression of this impact causation that you referred to, this kind of Newtonian model of physics. But this whole idea that there is no such thing as an individual soup, that it is an individual thing, that it is essentially a bond, a soup of consciousness, and we are expressing as from moment to moment points of view, looking at itself. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Well put. Really well put. When you go down and delve down into subatomic particles, and as you say, scientists have been really looking to try to find the single thing, and they figure if they can find the single thing, they can define what all the other things are made of, all the big things. If they find the little things, and the closer they look at matter, the closer they find, the more they find the kind of nesting group of Russian dolls. They find smaller and smaller and smaller particles. But when you get right down to the basics, you find that a particle is nothing more than a puff of vibratory energy, of vibratory air. It's just nothing. It's not a thing. It's a relationship between other subatomic particles, between, matter and mind, between matter and the underlying field. So you can't really separate a subatomic particle out and say this is the thing. Things and individuality on that level don't exist.
Mm.
And then there's this. We had Will Arnst on the show a little while ago, and we looked at this issue in slightly a different way, but nonetheless no less interesting. What emerged out of that conversation is that, from the perspective of scientists that are operating on the assumption that nothing is real until it is observed, that we now have some discussion, some controversy amongst that community as to exactly what constitutes an observer. Is a dog an observer? Does one have to be conscious to be an observer?
I think that they've demonstrated that and I write about it in the Bond. There have been studies using equipment, and when equipment has kind of flashed on particles, the equipment itself becomes an observer. Mm-hmm. So matter can be an observer to some other matter. Mm-hmm. I think that the quantum particle lives in this kind of twilight world when it's on its own, but when it really comes into relationship with other matter, that also creates a what they call collapses the vector, collapses the superposition, the all possible selves of the quantum particle into a single thing, and makes it real. So there's actually been equipment, measurements, all of those things seem to act as an observation, in a sense, to pin something down that is ephemeral.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you talk about it in the first part of your book. You explore the physics of this from every perspective. It's a tour de force, and by the time you come to the end of it, you really are looking at it from the perspective of it being a shared circuitry. Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that what I've really tried to look at with the whole idea of the bond is that a bond exists between our bodies and the environment. For instance, we believe that we're built inside out, from the DNA to the tissues to the and cells and tissues to our organs, etc., and that it's pretty much a fixed blueprint. But they're now understanding that DNA is pretty much like the piano keys, and they only get played by environmental factors, things outside our bodies. So the water we drink, the air we breathe, the food we eat, the friends we surround ourselves with, the sum total of how we live our lives determines whether our gene piano keys get played, our genes get expressed. So what we're really saying is that we get created. This thing we think is so individual gets created by the environment, gets created from outside in. And so we have a bond with everything with whom we've come into contact. And that gets mimicked through other things, too, even our thoughts. We think they're so individual, but we now know that our thoughts are, when we see someone else have an action or an emotion, we ourselves, our own neurons fire as though it is we who are having the action or the emotion. So every time we try to perceive something in the world, we see someone else and anything else, we are basically taking in their thoughts and their actions and playing them in our own brains. So in a sense, we are merging with someone else pretty much at every moment that we're perceiving the world out there.
That's a mind blower.
So, it really is.
It all starts getting pretty messy.
Well, and I'll tell you the piece that's really interesting is I think myself of competing thoughts, and how personally, and this is where I relate to all of this, is I look at this and go, wow, what's this mean to me? And it's constantly, and by the way, Lynn, all your books have affected me this way. The Intention Experiment and The Field both had a tremendous impact on me. But this idea of competing thoughts, when I'm conflicted, nothing happens. And I'll tell you one of the pieces. You mention it in this book, but it's also in your other books. It has to do with this state of coherence. And I'm not going to try to explain the science. In fact, I'm going to rely on you for that. But the piece of this that makes sense is when energies seem to be working together, they become quite powerful. However, when there's these sort of conflicting energies, and I again personalize this, conflicting, let's say, thoughts, for example, they cancel each other out. And I find myself personally, incompetent. It's like nothing occurs. And that's similar, and that's been illustrated. So is the state of coherence, am I right in sort of this way I'm tying this together?
Well, in physics terms, you are absolutely right in terms of how waves work. Waves, think of a sideways S. That's a sine wave, and that's a wave that a particle is represented by. And when particles are in sync, they're all waving up and down at the same way. So they're peaking and troughing in the same way. When they're not, when they're discordant, they are peaking when the other one is troughing and vice versa, and they do cancel each other out. So coherence is yet another thing, but coherence is kind of the same thing in that they're acting like one giant wave, so you can't really tell them apart. And that amplifies the effect. So there is coherence in nature. For instance, they find that live things like human beings have high degree of coherence in some of their quantum particles. So I think that when you think about yourself as this energy system, and you say you have discordant thoughts, in a way you're reacting very much like two waves out of sync.
Right. And I even like the language that there's constructive and destructive. That's sort of the language of the coherence, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Because that's how I experience it. I experience myself either in a state of like having constructive thoughts that are moving me towards my intention, for example, or I have these sort of conflicting pieces. And I'll tell you from this book, one of the ways I really related to this was this whole notion of fair. I have that deeply rooted, and I understand from reading the book that this is really, in essence, how we're hardwired. So this is not abnormal.
Share, fair, care.
That's right. These kind of components.
That's our little motto right now.
We love that.
We love it because
be fair.
Yeah, because that's kind of, so again, if I personalize it, this is kind of what brings me into coherence. So if there's some part of let's say, a situation that feels unfair, I won't be able to personally commit to it.
Yes, I think this is so deeply rooted, as you say. I mean, so much so that one thing that I've just come back from the States on the first leg of my Bond tour. I'm back again 3 more times. But
Lynn, you're a Bond girl.
Yeah.
I'm a Bond girl.
Who would have thought?
I've always wanted to be one, I must say, but I'm not blonde, so what can I do?
Well, there are some brunettes in there, I think.
But a little too old for it now, unfortunately. But one thing what struck me the last time I was in the States, the U.S. is feeling so manifestly unfair. It's shocking to me now to read some of the statistics, to know that in the place that has half of the world's billionaires, something like 39 million people are on food stamps and live below the poverty line. And 1 in every 6 person in America who wants a job can't get one, who wants full-time employment. And on. These kinds of statistics are just so shocking. There was information about how the 1% controls of the highest earners control 40% of the money. And these are the kinds of manifestly unfair conditions that really resonate in us and infuriate us. I'm not talking about socialism. I'm not talking about across-the-board sameness. But I'm talking about our sense of taking our turn. Because as I say in the book, that is deeply rooted. There is an "it's not fair" button in our brains. They even think that evolution occurred because of turn-taking. And so when things are unfair, we expect to take our turn, but we expect other people to take their turn too. And when it doesn't happen, it really creates a whole culture of greed. That was what I found really shocking. They figured this out with game theory. And there's one game they play called the Public Works game, where it's a group of people. We all get, say, $10, and we're all told to put a portion of that into a pot. And initially what they find is people are always really generous because the pot's going to be redistributed to everyone. And if everyone's generous, everybody gains. But what they find is that initially people are generous, but then if there are a few freeloaders not putting so much in, everybody loses. Everybody stops putting money in, and the whole thing falls apart. The whole thing becomes a culture of selfishness, and that's really what we've got right now. Very contrary to our nature that wants to, that drives to, and needs to share, care, and be fair. And so that's why we have this sort of vague sense that something isn't right, something is terribly unfair.
Well, you speak to loop back around to something that you set up a little earlier. You talk about the human beings being hardwired to be fair and to agree with each other, and that, as you said earlier on the show, that we understand and we feel into the emotions and the actions of others by simulating the entire experience for ourselves. And so we, to follow upon this, each of us have internalized, we must have some sort of somatic experience of this kind of dissonance that comes out of unfairness.
I think we do, and I think it corrodes everything. It creates a situation. It's just, think about it, when somebody's not generous and you've been, you pull back so easily, and you feel it in your body. You feel cheated. You feel like something vague has been lost, and you just can't identify it. But what it ends up being is you pull back. Let's say it's in business, and somebody tries to screw you, and that's pretty much how business works. It's always negotiate for more than your side. Right. That's what we're all told to do.
Predatory. But it would follow on this. It follows on this line of reasoning that the cheater themselves are equally at the effect of these choices.
Oh, everybody is. Everybody pulls back. Everybody starts playing the game of selfishness. It's with relationships. It's in your neighborhood. It's in business. All of those things get really corroded by unfairness. I wanted to tell both of you that I felt so strongly about this when I was in the States recently that I decided to create the Fairness Campaign.
I love it.
I wanted to bring this to people's attention. So we're putting up a kind of, principles of fairness next week on our website that's going to talk all about this and get people to start bringing this into their life, just bringing some principles of fairness, because it's destroying our society. It's destroying, and then on our individual level, it's destroying us.
Yeah. Well, let's go briefly. Let's go down the list of principles of fairness.
Well, briefly, they are basic things like, as I said, you start with generosity. Start with generosity in your relationships, in your business, in your neighborhood, in your community. Always look to the whole, and look to the relationship as important, not the individual. See, when we are, what I'm really looking for at with fairness is the idea of reaching across the divide all the time, because we have this mentality that is just so with us of what's in it for me. And so this is the way we start looking at people. You know, we see only people like us. We can't see other arguments anymore. We can't see beyond a relationship oftentimes. What's in it for me? Mm-hmm. How do I gain from this thing? What's the personal gain here, as opposed to the relationship? So it really is, the principles are all about fundamentally changing the way you view relationships, changing the way you view just the way you see and the way you perceive things, so that you're honoring the bond, the space between. In the case of a relationship, that you're honoring the relationship and not what you can get out of it, and saying to yourself things like, well, what do I have to be to allow that situation to thrive, allow
beautiful.
that person to be all he can be. And so when you focus, you change your focus from me to us, to the relationship, everything changes. And also it's about starting out not with a culture of misery, but a culture of generosity.
The gift culture.
When you're generous, it changes the game completely.
Yeah.
Artists refer to this as the gift culture. They're intimately connected with a sense of receiving from the whole of the consciousness. You receive insight, you receive inspiration, and then the doing aspect is about the expressing of it in terms of in space-time. But they're very tuned into the gift nature of things, and it gets very, very muddy when that bond gets, as you say, this wonderful word you're using, corroded. It becomes corroded when the gift becomes some sort of mercantile exchange, when everything is reduced to a transaction. But before we move, before you either comment on that or move on, I would like to invite you to share with our listeners the website so that they can participate and keep track of developments with the Fairness Campaign.
Wonderful. It's all going to be at our website, www.thebond.net.
Super.
Okay, listen, we need to take a quick break. When we get back, there's several pieces that I've wanted to bring up, but one of them that really struck me is this idea of paradox and how we deal with paradox in terms of our interrelatedness. And I thought that was really a powerful piece. So we're going to take a quick break, but when we get back, we'll talk more about that here on Cutting Edge Consciousness. Stay with us. Welcome back to Cutting Edge Consciousness. Freeman Michaels here with Barnet Bain, and we are talking today to Lynne McTaggart, who is the author of The Bond, Connecting Through the Space Between Us. She, of course, is also the author of The Intention Experiment and The Field and other books as well. And before we left for break, I brought up the notion of paradox and actually becoming comfortable with a certain amount of paradox. Part of what I got, Lynne, from what I've read, and of course I've read other books of yours, is that there is this competitive thing where we're pitting ourselves against one another, and we're taking a position, as you've expressed, is highly ineffective. It's unsustainable. In fact, it's created, crises in essence. And we see this, really amplified with, warring parties at home and abroad. I mean, I think of American politics as sort of warring parties, but clearly in wars, such as Palestinians and Israelis and others. And I know you've got some research with this. So the idea isn't that we agree with everything that a person, says or believes or whatever, and then we actually move into a place of kind of, and I want to get this right, kind of comfort with the discomfort or the paradoxes, right?
Well, you honor the relationship, and when you do, it's okay to have differences because that's not what's connecting you.
Right.
You're not just connecting through sameness. A perfect example of that is Mark Gerson, who is a very good ambassador that works with the UN. He works in areas of crisis, and he's kind of a peacemaker. And he works with an organization in Palestine that is composed of both Israelis and Palestinians. And he couldn't figure out how they worked so well together. And so he said, well, how can you do this? And they said, well, we've learned to live with paradox. And he said, what do you mean? And they said, well, let's just take an example, the birth of Israel. So a Palestinian wrote a paragraph about it that began the disaster. And it was all about the terrible things that the Palestinians had been deprived of their homeland, and they were refugees, and they had been invaded. And then the Israeli wrote his version, and his version said the historic day of independence. And it talked about how, wasn't it wonderful that the Israelis finally got their historic homeland, the Jews got their homeland, the UN had sanctioned it, but from that beginning they had been attacked and beleaguered from all sides. Nevertheless, they bravely defended the Israeli nation. And, the sad thing, and the reason for the enduring conflict, but also the real point here is that both versions are true.
Yeah,
right.
And that's pretty much always the case with situations where people are in conflict. Both people have a point of view. And so when you start working, changing your perspective on relationships, but also looking to see the whole, which is a big part of the bond and some of the suggestions I make in the bond, you learn to take a higher perspective, an aerial perspective, where you're realizing that the connection comes from someplace else. A perfect example of that is what occurred in Boston a few years ago. A Planned Parenthood was shot up by a gunman, and several people died. And so the leaders of both sides of this highly contentious subject, abortion, decided to meet together, the pro-life and the pro-choice people. And so they met in secret for 6 years. And during that time, they decided to try to cool down their inflammatory language and just dialogue with each other, just speak and talk about what was really important to them and why they came to believe with what they believed. And over time, they learned to listen with respect and start monitoring their body while they were listening, and to just really hear for the first time instead of reacting and trying to be right or winning a debate. And after a while, they set up a hotline so that when there were threats to the pro-choicers, the pro-life people were the ones giving them the heads up. So they were watching each other's backs. So at the end of the 6 years, they held a press conference, and the reporters there said, so who won the debate? And the pro-life and the pro-choice people said, well, no one. We actually believe more what we thought we believed. We've become more entrenched in our beliefs, over time, having expressed them so openly. So they said, well, then it must have been a failure. And they said, oh, no, we go out together now. We party together. We look after each other's children. We love each other. And so that's an example where, they still have, they still disagree with everything the other person stands for, and yet they've created a connection in the space between. They found the connection that's always there, because that's the real point. Nature has created us to always seek connection. We mimic each other. We try to belong. If I'm happy, I'm more likely to make you happy. We need to take turns. There is a connection always trying to be born here. And when you open yourself to that and understand it's always there, even in the most disagreeable person, you realize you can get past colliding worldviews.
I love that story.
It's beautiful.
There is another example in the book of what happens when you make a friend of uncertainty, the compassion that can be born out of that. You talk about, I think it's a former Nazi or some young man who in the Hitler Youth movement.
The Hitler Youth guy.
And and the daughter of a survivor.
A Holocaust survivor.
A Holocaust survivor. Would you speak to that? Would you share that with us?
Sure. I mean, this was really a wonderful situation, and the power of forgiveness, using the bond for forgiveness, because many people who write about forgiveness consider a wrongdoing like a knot. Two people get into a knot together because the whole balance in the relationship becomes skewed. The person who has done the wrongdoing has taken power away from the other person, and so there is this imbalance. And what happens and what works best in terms of restoring that balance is a kind of deep truthfulness where each side really reveals how he or she feels and really comes to terms with that feeling. And the most wonderful example of it occurred in a healing workshop with a former member of the Hitler Youth Movement, Gottfried Leach, and Mary Rothschild, whose mother and father, I believe, were survivors of the Holocaust. So they got together. They were placed together as this healing workshop was doing, placing these kinds of parties together. And Leach was really dreading this. Gottfried Leach was dreading this because the last person he wanted to meet was the child of a Holocaust survivor. So Mary Rothschild kicked it off, and she turned to him and said, "Right. So how active were you in persecuting the Jews?" And he said, "Well, I might have beaten up a few people, I might have smashed a few windows, but, I was only 16. Well, that did not satisfy her. So she looked him in the eye and she said, "Okay, in 10 years older, would you have sent my relatives to the gas chamber?" And with that, he just was speechless. He looked down at the floor for a very long time, and he finally emerged and said, "I just don't know." And with that incredible admission, this revelation as to his true self, that I could have been a mass murderer.
Sure.
That was a entirely different level of truth that just got exposed. And from that truth, from that admission, from that real looking inside to the real truth of what his actions were, that released something that, a kind of release that she didn't really even know she was seeking. So it was he who was then really weeping and upset about it all and saying, I'm in the dungeon of history now. I was a Nazi. Well, my children are Nazis. My grandchildren are Nazis. I'll never escape this. And something of his admission just released something inside of her so that she ran over and grabbed his hand and said, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." And he was just blown away. It was, as some forgiveness writers say, that moment when the heart leaps across the fence. And by that he means that, as Leach himself said, I was in the abyss, and she threw a bridge across it and invited me to meet her on it. There was a feeling through the palpable in the room that this was not the other anymore. This was not Nazi and Jew. These were people who were basically saying, "It's over. I and thou. Now we're one." And I think that's what happens whenever you really honor the bond. You provide that kind of real truthfulness of who you are. You get past these superficial differences, even incredible wrongdoing, to the real connection that always exists there, that always wants to be born.
There's that humility that comes and leads to this understanding of the action taken by the other. And it speaks to what you referred to earlier in your book about how we seek to understand others through the simulation of their experience in our own consciousness. So here's this wonderful woman, Mary Rothschild, who had the humility to live into another's experience and understand it so personally that she could forgive, if not the what of what was done, the why.
Exactly. Absolutely. Beautifully said.
And there's a piece about this that I think is really important and very apropos in this moment because, this whole demonizing, which both Barnet and I have talked about this. It's sort of it's this shadow effect, if you will, that there's this pointing out there of the them, when oftentimes it's a part of ourselves that we want to project out and make the villain. But the problem with doing that, and this is my opinion, is that when we do that, we have to keep creating new villains to kill, as it were, new, bad guys, and we live in this state of good guy and bad guy. And that's not how it works. We go back to the idea of the paradox, that there's a certain amount of contradiction in being human, and there's a certain amount of light and dark in all of us. And to the degree that we can, in my mind, see that in ourselves, we can then be more effective in addressing it outside of ourselves.
I think that's so well said. Absolutely. I mean, this is the problem of what's going on in the States now, and many places around the world, but particularly in the States, the demonizing of the other political party. It's got to a shocking degree where, even college students can tick, I only want to room with a Republican or a Democrat. And this idea that, that we have to always seek sameness in order to connect is really, pulling the country apart. And as you say, a lot of people feel like they have to have an identity by creating a demon of someone else. And, that's what gangs do.
Yeah.
So that's what, rival gangs like the Crips and the Bloods tend to do. They've been damaged in a way from some real pain and hurt, and they feel they have to create an enemy of someone.
That's it. And it's interesting because part of my background is working with a group called Homeboy Industries, which is here in L.A., with gang members. And the whole idea that it's just this hurt that's being expressed and this anger that's being expressed and projected quite literally onto someone who, you create the rival, you create the rival gang, but it's a reflection of ourselves. Because the brilliant part, and Father Greg Boyle brought these men, and mainly men, some women together, only to find out that, similar to your stories, that very quickly they became to assimilate and find that they were the same, and very much the same. I mean, really the same. And even Black and Latino or other nationalities found the similarities when they were working side by side. So it's the constructive nature of doing something constructive. And I know you write about this because there's so many stories of where communities, get together to, raise a barn, as it were, and find their commonality. And that's where we as individuals can kind of make choices that then strengthen the bond and begin to build community, right?
Well, I think that's the beauty of what they call the scientific term for it is a superordinate goal,
yes.
which is barn building.
Yes.
And I talked about that wonderful psychological study where they sent a group of 12-year-old Protestant boys to a camp, and this is in the days before informed consent. So all of the camp counselors were actually psychologists in disguise. They had separated the boys. They had them create separate identities, separate names, the Rattlers and the Eagles, and they engaged them in highly competitive games. And they lived in separate quarters. So after a while, they didn't have to stoke competition. The boys were killing each other. I mean, they were ripping up their flags. They were beating each other up. They were stealing things. And nothing could actually get them together. So then the counselors, psychologists, created a series of crises in the camp that could only be sorted out by the collective endeavors of all the boys, like messing up with the water supply and things like that.
So
and what
familiar.
ended up happening was amazing stuff. The boys ended up, becoming really good friends, and they even voted unanimously to ride home together. So the power of this coming together of a common goal has a real scientific basis. They know that when people do the same thing, when they barn build or they do something together with an we're all in it together rush, their brains start operating in tandem. It's this constructive interference, as you were talking about. We all start operating in sync. And also, like they found with Oxford rowers, when people are rowing in a group, they have a higher pain threshold than when they row individually. So it's like the act of working together for a common goal raises everybody's game.
I love it. One of the things, too, that you've pointed out, which I think is so powerful, and I want to make sure it gets expressed in this interview, is the power of just a few individuals to affect the collective. I know so many people today feel so helpless. And you say, well, I'm going to let you say it because there's so much power in just a few people sort of modeling what you're talking about, that, it's not how we think it is. We're not trapped under this big machine. There is, in fact, tremendous power, and we see this in nature, where just a few adjustments, as it were, really shifts the collective. So if you could express that a little bit, I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, there's some good reasons for this, too. The whole problem is we're in, and we do think, as you say, that the big guys in charge have to fix things.
Right.
And they can't even seem to speak to each other on either side of the aisle. But the interesting thing is it doesn't have to happen from there. It can happen from below, and an entire culture of selfishness can be turned around. Scientists have found two things. One is, as we said, we're so infected by each other's emotions, actions, everything, that if somebody, one person, does an act of kindness, it will travel 3 degrees down the network, which means it'll affect my friends, my friends' friends, my friends' friends' friends. So one act of generosity that I do will cause a total viral ripple effect of generosity down the network. So in other words, we're kind of using our natural tendency to bond and to mimic each other for a common good. The other thing that happens is, remember I talked about that public goods game?
Yes.
Scientists have also found that, even in a culture of selfishness where no one's giving, all it takes is a few strong reciprocators, a few game changers to turn the whole game around. If I can show you this with one little example that's so lovely. There's a woman who was in an office, typical office, what's in it for me, group of selfish individuals, very competitive, etc. She was tired of this, so she decided to leave the change in the Coke machine where she got her Coke every day on her coffee break, every day with a little note saying, "Your Coke has been paid for, pay it forward." Now, this completely freaked out her colleagues. They started spying on the Coke machine. They started creating basically a neighborhood watch scheme to find out who was the secret Santa in the organization. So she upped her game, moved to another floor, and started leaving donuts on that floor. So this completely transformed this office. This created a closer business. It created a culture of generosity. It was the conversation at dinner for weeks and weeks and weeks. So it just takes sometimes just that tiny little act to completely change the game. But also the wedding, too, which is part of the fairness campaign and certainly an underpinning of The Bond, my book, is the whole idea that it doesn't really require any kind of big actions. It requires just simple actions like, one of the most revolutionary things you can do as a Democrat is to hug a Republican. It requires a few kinds of little superordinate goals in your neighborhood or your business or among your circle.
That's it.
And just honoring the bond and believing that it just, it doesn't have to be this culture of selfishness, not for one more day.
Well, as you know, Lynn, in Los Angeles, you're more likely to find a Democrat hugging a mass murderer than hugging a Republican. But you have certainly been a way shower here. What strikes me powerfully is that you've written this gorgeous book.
Absolutely.
It's taken what has heretofore been some very esoteric science and some very esoteric philosophy, and mainstreamed it and presented it in such a way that is so compelling and so inspiring and so accessible, and that there is such an audience for this now that it says to me that something fundamentally powerful is happening, that we have ticked over into the integrative side of the coming together of whatever mysterious evolutionary forces are on the move. They are beginning to coalesce into something orderly. Even as we become friends with that uncertainty, there is something beautiful and powerful that is beginning to emerge very much in the mainstream, and you are a leading voice of that.
Well, thank you so much for all of those beautiful comments. I think that's right. I think this is a time of hope because, we're all sitting here feeling like we're on the precipice of crises, and we can't really make sense of all of these collective crises, and they're terrifying. But I think we have to take hope in the understanding that what's ending is a terrible mindset. Maybe a necessary mindset, but a destructive mindset nonetheless. And, this ending is truly the path to our future, our future of thriving, surviving, and being caring and sharing and fair.
Yeah, and the word crisis, I'm sure you know this, that in the Chinese language, there's two characters to represent the word, and one, of course, is danger, but the second is opportunity. I see opportunity. I mean, personally, this is how I'm choosing to view it. And again, the opportunity it starts with embracing other, the concept of something that we're calling not ourselves, only to come to what binds us. And I love the quantum level, where we really recognize on the most fundamental level what Barnet illustrated to start with, that it's not just that I'm my brother's keeper, I'm actually my brother in a very real...
Well, I'm glad you got it right.
I got you wolfed at it in the beginning, but we came around, Barnet. That's the fundamental piece that I think is so exciting, because it's bigger than just the conversation we're having. Just the notions of this new science are opening so many doors to human potential, and that's the piece that I love.
I know, I absolutely agree with you, because we've kind of known these truths for centuries, but science is finally catching up with it. And these new discoveries underpin everything that many of the ancients have believed and espoused for so many centuries. And it's all hopeful. It's all good news. It's all hopeful news. It's all about living in a much, much, much better way, a much more connected way, where we're really we're living with nature. And I think what's really important too is that we do have this choice. We're really the most important generation that's ever lived, because everything we choose to do now is going to affect not only our children's children, but people for all time. Mm-hmm. And, we have two paths, the path of what I call greater atomization, where we go further and further to things and ring-fencing things that are different from us, or we can embrace wholeness. And I think that really is the only path to our future. And it's the path that is with nature, not against nature.
So I have to ask you, because this is you're still on tour and you're still promoting this, but I always have one eye up the road, and I'm wondering what you're working on next. What can we expect in 18 months?
Oh, gosh. I think there's a lot of message. I think I have to bring this message around for a long time. There is the fairness campaign. Yeah. There is the living the bond. There's much more. I wanted this to be the clarion call, and I'll be working on and providing more instruction as I've researched as well, how to take this into your life.
So there'll be curriculum following.
There'll be a lot of curriculum following, yes.
Beautiful. And we look forward to that. And we want to be sure to give our listeners, before we let you go, again, the website is www.thebond.net, correct?
That's it.
Beautiful.
And so, very, very important, before we let you go, am I going to see you in Tucson?
Barnet's filling out his social calendar, Lynn.
Tucson, and I am talking Brian into coming too.
Fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to it. Sandy will be there too.
And wonderful.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
It's been my real pleasure.
It's been really a joy.
And thank you all, listeners, for tuning in to Cutting Edge Consciousness. You can join us on the web at www.cuttingedgeconsciousness.com. If you enjoyed the show, remember it's available in podcast, so you can download it and send it to everyone you know. Thanks for tuning in, and join us next week here on Cutting Edge Consciousness.